Hey, party people, and welcome to the P-Frog Vlog. Wow!
Next on Eternal Durdles.
This episode is supported by our Durdle Maniacs, who enjoy ad-free content as well as bonus content that can be found either on Patreon, Spotify, or YouTube. If you're thinking about supporting the show, we'd really appreciate it, and you can find us on any of those mediums. What it do? Hello and welcome to Eternal Durdles. I'm your host, Zach Clark, and with me as always, Phil Blackman. Phil, how's it going, man?
Zach, so I hear the entire community is up in arms about getting Sensei's top off the ban list, which is very exciting.
It seems like. No, it's this is an episode I would say in response to our friends over at Eternal Durdle, who just put out an episode about Psychic Frog needing to be banned, and I think Phil and I might have slightly different but aligned takes on the Psychic Frog discussion. I mean, I'm just going to come out and say it. Personally, I think it's way too early to be talking about banning Psychic Frog when we haven't banned all the other things that need to get banned yet. Like, let's take a beat, hit the 26th, see what the format looks like, because I have a feeling myself that Psychic Frog is a symptom and not an actual problem of the format. But with it being protected by grief and Orcish Bowmaster stopping you from finding answers, and just all in all, people not playing the cards they need to be playing to remove it from the board, which there are plenty in this format. I think that Psychic Frog is fine for now, but may need to be looked at a bit later. Phil, what do you think? Eternal Durdles is proud to be sponsored by Moxfield. Moxfield is the best Magic the Gathering deck building website on the internet. You can create, share, and find decks from Commander to Legacy, and even fan-supported formats like Pre-Modern and Old School. You can see all of our decks on our Moxfield. Follow the links below to stay tuned.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a source to plowshares, guys. Like, it just, like, these types of threats just don't scare me as much. You know, like, I think that the argument for Psychic Frog has been similar to that of Dreadhorde Arcanist. And, I mean, I don't know. I think that, like, if you were to look back at Dreadhorde Arcanist, like, it was in a format that also had Oko in it.
Yeah,
like there were other things that were like, you know, the major headlines of like things that needed to go on top of like this other thing that was also very good. And so it feels to me like there are so many additional bigger outliers than Psychic Frog. But it might also be that since my only experience playing against Psychic Frog has been as the guy who's casting Source of Plowshares, that it just hasn't. Like, don't get me wrong, it's good. Like, it's an Ophidian, and you know that's powerful. Like if anything, I found that like the more powerful interaction with it is how it just like further pumps Murktide. You know, like, but I don't know if that's an indictment of Psychic Frog as much as it is an indictment of Murktide, which, you know, is also like, okay, it's Murktide. Like, Murktide also shouldn't exist, but okay, here we are.
Yeah.
I think that like I agree that everybody is really hot on Psychic Frog going as the new 2-mana card advantage du jour of the Days Wasteland show. And I'm just of the opinion that I think that there's so many other diseases around it that it's just another one in the line of Ren 6 and Dreadhorde Arcanist and Death Shaman. And
I found one of the arguments, and maybe I don't understand the argument. You know, Bryant Cook was talking about how decks are, you know, Blank's Lightning Bolt is what Bryant was saying. And Blank's Lightning Bolt, and thusly decks are skewing Lightning Bolts to play more fatal pushes, and then because of that, they're losing out on tempo, which is an argument I don't quite understand. Maybe I'm just not big brain enough to understand that argument. But I think that's fine. Like when look, the format is absolute nightmare right now. So every card in a winning deck is going to feel oppressive. Like, that's just how, you know.
I want to just tag on to your argument real quick of like Lightning Bolt not being like maybe the best thing to do as like the threats have changed. That there's precedence for that of like, you know, the classic like always will be there removal not being good at certain periods of time. Like there was a time that I distinctly remember as a Miracles bro where like we were cutting a source, like the number of Source to Plowshares that we played, because the format was like Baleful Strix and Snapcaster Mage, and we evolved and
like a red elemental blast instead.
Like, well, it was just that like your single piece of removal always traded down, or it was trading for like, to get like Leovold.
Something
Like
that didn't
back when
matter.
that was the thing, it was like, okay, well, you don't want to use your Swords to Plowshares on a Baleful Strix. You don't want to use your Swords to Plowshares on a Snapcaster Mage. You have to use your Swords to Plowshares on a Leovold, but you don't want to, right? Like there was a time where it was like, oh, but nobody was saying like any of these cards need to go because Swords to Plowshares was, no longer like the best piece of removal option that was available to you. You know what I mean? And then also on your thing of not understanding the argument, the other thing that off of that notion that I think is like, remember when we were last episode where we had mentioned like the meme about like ban everything until Tarmogoyf is good?
Yeah.
And really, like the way that everybody actually behaves is you ban everything until exactly Blue-Red X Delver is the best thing to do.
Yes.
And so, like, even though like this is now just making it so that Blue-Black Delver is the best thing to do, that like it's like, wait, we should go back and like make sure that Lightning Bolt is always the best thing. And it's like, it doesn't need to be.
I think
like there are no sacred cows.
I think a thing that people kind of are forgetting now is the paradigm of tempo has shifted. Tempo is no longer the deck that like ekes by, like ends the game with 0 cards in hand and 4 life. Like that's not what tempo does anymore, and it hasn't really been that deck since like Treasure Cruise. And that and I'm not saying that's good or bad necessarily, but like one of the things. Okay, so Phil Gallagher said something about like every time the Delver Shell gets a 2 mana like card advantage engine, in this particular scenario, it's 2 mana for Psychic Frog, or before it was 2 mana for Expressive Iteration, 2 mana for what was the other one? Dreadhorde Arcanist, right?
Red and 6, yeah.
Yeah, every time that happens, it's bad for the format. Eventually, changes need to happen. That's fine. And again, ostensibly, I can agree with that statement, but let's get rid of the problems that are actually affecting the format first, and then see if Psychic Frog is even really a problem. Like, I put it this way. I was so adamant. I've been wrong before. I've been so adamant back in the day that, like, Uro's got to go. Murktide Regent. Like, I didn't buy Murktide Regents for the longest time because it's like, this card's just going to get banned, and then I just wasted, like, $70 in a time where I couldn't afford to waste $70, And so oftentimes I think that these cards just either get power crept out, which is shitty, but like that's what happens in the format, or like a ban happens and that shell is just not as powerful as it once was, or the format shifts in a way where like people are like, yeah, Murktide Regent, whatever, I'll just Swords to Plowshare. That's a deck that people are playing now, So I think that we at least need to see if it's even worth banning Psychic Frog before in the meta that exists after Grief and possibly Orcish Bowmasters goes. I think that it just behooves us to not move with lightning speed every single time a ban is like imminent, and just say like, okay, hold on, let's like look at the format after we make this ban. Now, do I trust WotC to make those impactful decisions in a timely manner? Of course I do not. I think if you watch our argument episode where we both defend and prosecute certain cards, one of the things I say in that episode about Daze is like, if they ban Daze, I don't actually trust WotC to come back in time to be like, oh, the data is showing that that was a mistake. They just like, they're too gun shy about banning things to ever unban them, and they are afraid to ban things in a timely manner. So yeah, I don't trust them to do these things in a time that makes sense to people who live in the real world, because they don't have to play this format. They're not locked into this format. They're doing other stuff. They're playing Canadian Highlander or something like that. And plenty of us play other formats. I get that, but like, I just don't trust WotC to make those decisions in a timely manner, which is why I don't want them to go, oh, we're just going to ban Psychic Frog immediately, and then like, we'll see what the format looks like after that.
I hear what you're saying, and I counter it I counter some of it to the extent that if WotC were actually to do what I think would be necessary for the format to feel remedied even in the slightest, that a more aggressive announcement that is Grief and Bowmaster and a bunch of other things, like if they get aggressive, and part of that means that there's an extended collateral damage that leads into Psychic Frog as well, I don't think anybody loses sleep over it.
No,
right?
I won't
And
be sad. You know,
I also the other thing that I noticed too is I feel as though you and I, when we talk about Psychic Frog not feeling as much of a problem because there's so many other things, and I feel like the rest of the community is just very much all on the same page that Psychic Frog is too good. Like for some reason, I'm not sure why. Like I play against Psychic Frog plenty. Like, but like, and it is good. Like it's not like it's a good card for sure. It just does not strike me at the level that everybody is talking about it as a problem that needs to go, in ways that there are so many other cards that feel that way. Now, I have to imagine that is just because my experience playing against the card is as the Swords, Plowshares, Terminus guy, and so my relationship to the card is just like my personal experience is biasing my outlook here. But like I see other cards that are like, you know, in the way that like you have to adjust your deck building knowing that Psychic Frog is in the meta, is like, oh, instead of Lightning Bolt, I have to play other removal spells, which it's like, okay, well, I think that's good, right? Like,
yeah,
I don't think that like everything needs to fall in line to make the best decks, best options forever. But and I also think that like I want to just go back on what you talked about just a moment ago about the argument of like tempo inching across the finish line and that not being the case anymore. I think that that's also the bread and butter straw man of like years past, that the tempo deck was always traded the early game, like the disruption and free spells in the early game, for a subpar and worse late game. And if somebody can just outlast the early game, that has not been the case for a long time.
Yeah, I think that's just like Treasure Cruise.
Right? I would argue that like the fact that you've been just dunking on Murktide Regent for the last since MH2, that like it's like, oh, if you get out of the early game, your opponent just slams an 8/8 flyer. Like that, there's no there. I think the argument of like tempo should be this thing that like if you can escape the early game and get to the mid to late game, then they just run out of gas and they just can't do anything. That's just not true. Like it's just objectively not true anymore. Like it was a long time ago. It was. But like now it is just not. And it hasn't been for a very long time. And yes, like the card advantage stuff, like going over the top, like to be fair, I would argue that the stuff, like it's not every time Delver gets card advantage, right? Because 4-color control decks were using Expressive Iteration and Ren in 6, and what was it? Dreadhorde Arcanist was used in Pokepal alongside like Oko, and like it's not just Delver unilaterally getting these card advantage engines. The problem is and has always been that the best version of any of those things is always going to be Days Wasteland. Yeah. Like you could look at that, you could in the same argument that you could say like Ren in 6 or Dreadhorde or whatever, you could just say Up the Beanstalk, right? And the best shell for Up the Beanstalk is just the Days Wasteland shell, right? Like it may not show up in the same way where it's like, oh, it's not Delver plus Days on turn 1 go, like die roll is exacerbated. But the argument, the actual problem of the Days Wasteland shell compressing everything and being the best shell for everything, the problem is that every single best option always goes back to the best shell. And that best shell is causing all of these additional problems. But like, should these cards go? Sure, probably. Like it's totally fine if they do. Like that format will probably be better off because it'll be a little bit more open, right? It's not just going to be nothing but power outliers plus the degenerates stuff that was like power mistake or design mistakes from years past. But the notion that it's just Delver getting these 2-mana things and that's disrupting the idea of what tempo is supposed to be and that's why it needs to go. That's just not true. That is just not real life. That's just not real life. From my POV, like that's the same argument for like, you know, that control has to be like you always hit your land drops, and if you ever miss a land drop you just die. Like that's just not the case anymore because you don't ever spend mana on counter magic, right? Like maybe there was a paradigm where it's like, yeah, if you miss your land drop and then you can't like both go counterspell plus something else and you miss, like if you can't hold that mana up, like that's really bad for you because your opponent can then play through all these. That's just not true because mana, like counter magic doesn't cost mana. So the entire paradigm of how like play patterns and archetypes operate is different. So tempo hasn't been like if you can escape the late game. Delver has had the best late game since MH2 for sure, when they got pre-con to deck, and Ragavan was like giving them a way to like jump into the late game, or whether it was DRC or Oko, or when they started splashing Uro, or when they got Murktide. Like it's That's not true. That's not true that like you have to get rid of the card advantage engine so you can bring it back in check. Of course not. It's Days Wasteland.
Well, so going from that, we have like I said, I just wanted to have an opinion that is out there about Psychic Frog, but I wanted to pivot, Phil, to the text message exchange we had this afternoon when I was walking around at work, and I thought I thought about something. I was like, if they do get rid of the beanstalk, it's still going to be miserable for Phil because Phil doesn't like Up the Beanstalk. Because I'm going to, as an Up the Beanstalk player, right? I'm going to immediately pivot to like One Ring, Minsk and Boo, like that same like 4-mana slam the thing like style of control deck, which is again not great. Like 4 miracles, it is not great to be a miracles player in that sort of just slam that sort of thing format.
So I would the rationale and the argument that I would make to like, is Minsk and Boo miserable? Absolutely. Is the ring more or less miserable? Pretty much. But the difference is if Up the Beanstalk were to go, right, the best way to build Beanstalk is just put Beanstalk into play and spam your shit, right? Or if you are like, I want to play the control side of Up the Beanstalk. If you want to play optimal Up the Beanstalk, you just play Days Wasteland, Orcish Bowmasters, Murktide Regent. Like, that's actually the best show for Beanstalk. But the problem with Beanstalk is that it removes the option to play any other version of control. Like, you have to start at Force of Will, the Cantrip Suite, whatever your removal is, and Up the Beanstalk. If Beanstalk goes, then you can be like, yeah, I want to play Minsk and Boo One Ring. And then I can be like, well, somebody else is going to want to play Teferi Narset. And then, I'll be on the other side where I'll be like, okay, well, then I want to play underneath all that. And I'm going to play, Unexpectedly Absent or some shit that isn't as good, right? But like, at least there's an argument for options where it's not like this is definitively better than this and this is like, if you're playing One Ring Minsk and Boo, I can be like, okay, well, you're kind of clunky. Like, I can probably spell pierce you to the point that it's like actually pretty good in a way where you just like Up the Beanstalk just doesn't give a shit. And
I think
vice versa.
That all comes down to the what coalesces after these bans happen, right? Like, assuming that like Up the Beanstalk gets hit, right? Then you can make those decisions.
Yeah, like my thing with Up the Beanstalk is it's one of those things, again, like similar to how we've talked about all the cards that have gotten banned, and like Psychic Frog is now in that space. Like, let's say if Expressive Iteration was unbanned and Dreadhorde Arcanist was unbanned and Psychic Frog was left in the format, and now you actually had to make decisions about what's in that 2-drop slot, right? And then there would be different variations because you're like, oh, well, if you play Dreadhorde Arcanist, then Bolt is still good. But if you play Psychic Frog, then Bolt is less good. But if you play Expressive Iteration and go long and then can like play around any removal and make it so that it doesn't matter as much, like maybe there's some intricacies there. Like, all of that stuff is like, if you have options, but Psychic Frog just happens to be filling that option right now. And like, it is supplemented by Bowmaster, which you were talking about, which Bowmaster just punishes you for trying to find answers because you just can't. You just die before that happens. But it's like, if all of those were together as options to choose from, then you would see actual variety of like, I want to respect this version more, I want to respect that version more. But right now it's just Psychic Frog and Bowmasters as the options, and that's it, right? Like, you play them, and you play them both because they're in the same colors, or you just are like, you know what, I'm gonna issue Bowmaster because I can play Psychic Frog, and everybody has to like, consolidate themselves, so Bowmaster gets pushed out because the best deck doesn't actually care about Bowmasters.
And people still have to play around Bowmasters whether or not you're playing it. They don't know.
Yeah, I'm saying that like the argument for that side of it, of the constant banning of the symptom versus the actual disease, has led to, we get to the space now where Psychic Frog again is a problem, when really it's the shell. But maybe if all of the diseases existed at the same time, maybe we have the experience of it feeling like there's more variety, even though these are all power outliers. Because if the power outliers all exist at the same time, the power flattens. Right?
Yeah.
Where it's like, when there's right, and if there's an individual outlier, you're like, oh, this is clearly an individual outlier. You could argue the same thing for Beanstalk if there was anything in the same space.
There's just not
for control decks. Like, if there was another option, and you could argue that if Expressive came off, maybe you're playing, am I Expressive or am I Beanstalk? Right? In the same way that you would argue that.
I don't think you want to play. You probably would not want to play them both, right?
Right, but I'm saying that like, if if expressive iteration existed, maybe there's a deck that tries to play both, and they just happen to have a lot more air in their deck, or maybe they play it as a 1-of or whatever, or like they try and finagle numbers. But like, at least there would be an argument to be made for, if you were a control deck, you're like, okay, well, I want to be Beanstalk, and I don't want to play Days Wasteland. I want to be like a more long game control deck. In which case, like, I'm sort of incentivized to be a Leyline Binding deck, but if I'm Leyline Binding, that means that I'm more exposed to Wasteland. So what I really want to do is I want to get my colors down, which means that Leyline Binding gets worse, which means that I'm not going to be enabling up the Beanstalk more. So maybe I do want to be an expressive iteration deck, but expressive iteration also means that I actually want to lower my curve because I want to be able to like get the 2-for-1 off of it more reliably. So maybe I like lean into that space. Like there's actual debate to be had about different options for archetype, like macro types. Whereas when we ban the individual things, it's just the individual power outlier, and that's the sole thing. And then we go, everything feels the same all the time because the power outliers are always the only ones that are worth playing. And so then we go, we got to ban the power outliers to like get the format healthy again. And that just is the recurring theme that always happens with these ban announcements. But I don't know.
And it's not like they're going to stop printing powerful cards that you have to buy. Right.
That's the undercurrent. That's the undercurrent of the whole thing of like why if you don't go after the disease, then you're always going to run into the same problem. And there's Psychic Frog is jumping out to me as the like if we didn't have these other things like Grief that needs to go as like taking the headline, if it was just Psychic Frog that felt like, oh, it's only Psychic Frog on the block is what we're talking about, we could just replay any of the other episodes of those other cards that have gotten banned for the same reasons, right? This one just happens to be that like the Stompy players are upset too.
Yeah. It's funny to me because there are so many pretty easy ways to get rid of it. Phil, do you know off the top of your head, pick your poison, is that an instant or a sorcery?
Sorcery.
It is a sorcery. Okay, so that can't actually get rid of Psychic Frog because it's like you can kill a flyer or something with it. Is that what it does?
Yeah, it kills a flyer. Yep.
Yeah, it kills a flyer, right? So unless you're like attacking in with a flyer, right, and your opponent blocks it with Psychic Frog and it somehow makes them bounce off each other, right?
But again, what you're talking about is, could you play other kinds of removal? Could you look at other kinds of removal to solve a problem?
Sure. Yeah.
And I think that you could. Like, I think that the notion that like maybe different kind of removal has to get introduced and accepted as part of like the mainstay removal of the format, as like, oh, now that these threats exist, that means that the stock of these other removal spells have gone up. And now we have to like look at them in ways that aren't like embarrassing or fringe. We have to look at them as legitimate like role players. That is good. Like that's fine. That's it's okay if it's not always lightning bolt, right?
Yeah,
that's okay.
I agree. I think that my biggest concern with that was just like what was Brian's argument that like the reach that lightning bolt gives is what's stopping like other problems in the format from becoming a thing. I couldn't figure out the like the trickle down effect of like blue red not like blue black red whatever not playing lightning bolt and that affecting the format in some negative way. I just and honestly like I said, Brian's a smarter guy than I am when it comes terms to Magic the Gathering. So there's very likely there's something in his headspace there that I'm just not seeing. But that to me was a statement. I was like, what?
I think that like one of the things, I mean, besides when we talk, like anybody online that I talk to as well, I have gotten the sense that a lot of the legacy community at large just sort of has ingrained in itself that the Delver shell has to be protected and be the best always. And if there is something that is making that not okay, then there is something wrong with the format. Like if the Days Wasteland cheap threat shell as, the good, like interactive fair Magic game that's like trying to get you down to 0 as like a healthy thing. Like if that isn't the best deck that we should herald as like the top of the format, if anything comes in and like circumvents that in any way, then we have to go after those problems to protect the thing. Now, the problem that with one of the outliers with that is Delver and that shell just always absorbs whatever the best thing is and makes it the best. So in this case, it's like there have just been enough ridiculous creatures in black that have been printed over the last couple of years that have just made it so that you don't even really need red. And if anything, the shell has become, instead of blue red X Delver, it's become blue black X Delver. So like the one that Ryan Frieger Freeburger won the last SCG con with, right? He was base blue black and he was splashing red for Dragon Rage Channeler and Molten Collapse, right?
Well,
like those are the red cards that make the cut because he cut his bolts for fatal pushes and then was rewarded because fatal push was better against Eldrazi and better against Psychic Frog. Now that's the kind of thing where it's like making that kind of call, I think, is good. Like having to adjust how you play for the threats. That's how Magic has always been. I think that's good. I think the stuff that like the stuff that needs to go is stuff that is making it so that archetypes as a whole are otherwise unplayable without it, right? Like Bolt, like Delver is not defined by Bolt, right? Like the any of the other macro types, like for Up the Beanstalk or things like or the stuff that Orcish Bowmasters pushes out, like there are macro types at large that these power outliers make it so that they just straight up cannot exist. Where it's like Bolt has never, like, yes, your creature could die to Bolt, and that's bad. But like there's like the conversation of is this playable or is it not playable because it has a 3-but? Oh, dies to Bolt. That's the same thing as dies to removal.
Yeah.
Because dies to removal has always been fine because the exchange is even. The dies to Bowmaster is not because Bowmaster kills you.
Yeah.
Not only does it go down to Bowmaster, but then Bowmaster kills you. That's the difference, right? If Lightning Bolt was a 1-mana creature that you 1-mana flash creature that ETB bolted, killed you something, and then also attacked you, and then also taxed everything you did, like then people would be like, maybe Bolt is over the line.
I think one of the other things about and I'm speaking as an ex-Teamer Delver player. The best finishes I have are with Teamer Delver. I thought I was big brain as a Teamer Delver player too. But I think that Delver players, there's a larger swath of Delver players in the format than any other archetype, I believe, any one single archetype. But every Delver player harbors under the delusion that they're like making big brain plays and like edging out like victory for the good guy, and that's just not the case anymore. I think that there was a time where, like, as the fun police, you were stopping more degenerate things from happening in the format by holding the line and looking into the dark, the icy blast of the future and being like, I have to hold the line as a Delver player. That's just not the case anymore. You're the villain now.
Honestly, Zach, like I would even argue that like the episode could have just honestly been half at least about that whole notion.
Yeah,
that, like,
that's true, right?
Like the lens at which we look at cards is through the lens of are you the good guy or are you the degenerate, and that paints how we view cards.
Phil, could you imagine if at any one point in time, right, like Storm or like Infect became like had the same share in the meta as Delver had, people would be losing their freaking minds about that. They'd be like, no, it's absolutely not. You got to ban the Storm mechanic. Infect has to be eroded out of the format. Like, people would lose their minds if a combo deck had the ability to be played in the same numbers as Delver.
I think that, like, aside from the ban discussion, which there's plenty of, and it's 2 more weeks, and then Grief goes, and hopefully they take care of Bowmasters and a bunch of other things as well, and we get at least a nice refresher to try new things, and hopefully new space is opened up a little bit. We know Grief is going, we just don't know what else is going, and there's been countless talks on that because we've been lame duck for however long now. But I think a good takeaway with all of the discussion that we've had is to unbias ourselves from the idea of like good guy decks and bad guy decks, and like it's like, oh, if you like, I feel like that just paints a lot of how we view cards and how we defend them. I mean, that has been the case, like literally what we just did for Days, where it's like, no, if you don't have Days as a hero protecting us from the degeneracy of the format, and then other people arguing that no, it furthers the degeneracy of the format, like arguing from that perspective of
it's
good
like
and bad,
a whole,
as opposed to what is just like healthy play patterns. Like,
it's a
if
good
we just
guy
look
with
at
a
everything
gun scenario, like
I'm just saying, like the lens at which we look at cards through as like what, like I think that the thing to look at to get rid of the actual lens that we should look at for cards isn't necessarily their power level, it's their gameplay experience.
Yeah.
And like, if anything, grief is not over the line. Power wise, it's not over the line. Is it a pushed unmask? Absolutely, because of its interaction with reanimate and animate dead. Is it too good? Like, you, if anything, you would argue that it's reanimate that is over the line, right? Because that's the thing that's actually doubling up on the thing and enabling it to be a problem. Because grief and not reanimate isn't actually a problem anywhere, right? But like, the experience of that play pattern is just so terrible that everybody wants it gone because it's miserable.
Yeah.
And that is the same for a lot of
There's
cards.
There's a reason why they restricted Hem to Torak back in the day, because people didn't want to see that anymore.
I think that, like, if there are cards that every time you play against them just devolve the game down into nothing matters, or like, or effectively nothing matters, because the only thing that matters is this power outlier card or play pattern that has existed in this game. And if that's the only thing that matters every time, and when it happens, the games suck, and when it doesn't happen, the games are actually interesting until it shows up, then maybe that's the thing to go after every time. And that's not like, oh, this is a like, grief is the villain and all this stuff, and like, you know, the heroes. It's not a good guy, bad guy situation. It's just, we want to have games that are interesting and compelling, and your decisions matter. And when you have stuff like Bowmasters, your decision, like, grief makes it so that you can't make any decisions. Bowmaster makes it so that by the time you make your decision, you're dead. Beanstalk makes it so that decisions don't matter because you can spew, right? So like, you never.
I
like,
literally
decisions
just unreasonably cast leyline binding just to draw cards sometimes.
Your decisions are always rewarded. I hate Urza Saga because I find it to be like, oh, your decisions don't matter. You just do what Urza Saga tells you to do and it will win you the game, right? Like, the cards that just make it so that the play patterns are redundant and don't matter outside of exactly the thing that thing is doing. I'm like, it's a play pattern problem. It's not necessarily a power level problem. It's not necessarily a good guy, bad guy problem. It's just like, let's just be objective about, like, is this fun or is it not? And from my perspective, Psychic Frog is not fun, or is fine, because it does not hit me the same way that it hits everybody else. But if the majority of people find that, like, oh, this is extremely unfun, we don't want it, then it goes. I'm the Miracles guy. I would love it if Top comes back. Watch any games now. People who played Top on camera or whatever, they were playing at the same speed that everybody else is playing. And the reason that, like, games back then went to time is because there were 4-color check pile decks that also played a singular win condition, and, you know, they would battle against each other, and so you had 2 win conless decks going at it, and that's why the stuff never went.
Out.
But like, but at the same time, even though I know that, like, if we were to objectively look at data and we were to objectively look at stuff, that, like, rounds still go to time just as much as they ever did, even when Top was around. But the majority of people are like, man, I really hate the play pattern of Top. It just makes me upset, and I have unfun. And so they went.
Sensei's Divining Top was a casualty of the Grand Prix circuit, honestly.
I'm not coming to, like, the defense of Top here. I'm just using it as an example of, is it too good? No. Power level wise? No. People got rid of it because it was just a miserable experience for them. Even though I didn't agree with it, the majority of the community did. So it went. And if the majority of the community also wants something else to go because of a miserable play pattern that doesn't necessarily affect me and wants to get rid of Psychic Frog, then get rid of Psychic Frog. It's fine. It's going to be okay, right? Like, if anything, get rid of the diseases. And then if there's some collateral damage because people just don't like a card because of the experience that it promotes on the format at large, then great. We're a community-driven format. Let's listen to the community at large. And if you happen to fall on the other side of that, whatever. You know, like, okay, the Psychic Frogs that I bought out of when MH2 was released for, like, the stable cards to have in the collection, okay, lost the money on that. Whatever. Like, that sucks. That's shit. But, like, them's the breaks. You know, You didn't buy Murktides because you were afraid that it was going to get banned, and now it's not even in the discussion on the block, right?
Yeah.
Nor does it seem like it will ever be, right? Same thing happened to me when I bought Ragavan. Same thing that happened, you know, like, it's just going to happen, and it's going to happen if we don't get rid of the diseases.
Sooner or later, we'll just have to start playing Modern, I think, Phil.
But, like, I also think that, like, if you, I mean, I'm still, there has yet to be argument to, like, unban a bunch of stuff, and I mean, it's like, we're just going to keep adding stuff to the list, but the more and more there are these cards that, like, just work with, you know, the certain shells that are obviously too good, that, you know, I'm still, like, an advocate of, man, I would love just a trial period of, like, we're actually going to unban all this other stuff rather than ban a bunch of things. Like, ban the objectively busted, broken, like, unfun play pattern stuff like grief, right? Like, that's just unfun play pattern. That's not promoting anything interesting. There isn't anything, there's no choice there. That's not fun. But, like, when it comes to something like Psychic Frog, if Psychic Frog had a competition, Like, if you had to choose between Psychic Frog or Dreadhorde Arcanist, I think that like that might be interesting. If you had to choose between Psychic Frog and Expressive Iteration or Bowmasters or Dreadhorde Arcanist, or like that could be interesting. Like, if you had to choose between all that and Ren and 6, and like now you have to play green instead of black, like is that interesting? Like, Ren and 6 was also around when Astrolabe was around, so like people were able to play Astrolabe in like play literally Grixis splashing 2 colors.
Yeah,
like
I was playing Miracles. So I was playing blue-white Miracles with Red and 6, just to like be like, okay.
I just think that like there would be there would be so much more variety to the format if we unbanned a bunch of stuff and then like gave that a go, because now we have decisions to make, and maybe you're not playing all 4 of something. Maybe you are doing a spread. Like, how interesting would it be if you looked at a deck list and you're like, oh, this person went 2 Dreadhorde, 2 Psychic Frog, 2 Expressive, and they're like hedging around to be able to like balance around whatever they're trying. I don't know, but like, have we ever been in a position to like even curry that? Like, the only time that has happened is like exactly now, where you're like, are you Bowmaster or are you Psychic Frog? And the best thing is probably just both, right? But like, if you actually had 5 different options to choose from, like, how do you actually balance that in a given metagame? And does that shift from week to week? And if we are just going to accept that Daze is our overlord for the rest of forever, then it's like, okay, well, if Daze isn't protecting the only 1 power outlier, it's protecting all of the power outliers. Maybe that's better. I don't know, man. But like,
all right. Well,
what were we even talking about? I don't know.
A sober take from Phil on this one. Anyhow, I think that's it for us this week. Thanks everybody for watching. If you get a chance and you like this episode and you want to see us talk about more stuff, certainly comment below, like the video. If you want to see some of our more interesting kind of wild take ideas that we have on our Patreon, we have a few argument episodes where Phil and I go back and forth on a bunch of different cards. You can subscribe to our Patreon for $5. That helps support the show, helps get us out to events, do interviews with people and stuff like that. So with that said, thank you everybody for watching, and we'll check you later. Before you go, I need some help. Please subscribe to this channel and do your part to help sustain the legacy content ecosystem. Just subscribing to this channel goes a long way to reminding YouTube that people love and support this format. Now, if you really want to go the extra mile, you should think about supporting us through Patreon. Both the links for subscription and Patreon are right here. And if you're listening on an audio format, you can go to patreon.com/eternaldurdles. Thanks so much for watching.